Okay, this is The Grass is Greener on WXRW 104.1 FM in Milwaukee. I am the host of the program, Gary Grass. With me is my co-host, Babette Gruneau.
Hi, and today we have Mark Sloboda, a Moscow-based international relations and security analyst, and it's a little early for me, apparently.
We're
Welcome, Mark.
we're recording this a little early for her. We usually do things later in the afternoon, let's say. But thank you very, very much for being here. Nice to have you back on the program. I just wanted to sort of frame the discussion by saying, I was on Twitter yesterday, and trending hashtag was Russia is collapsing. And you see these arguments. I mean, they've been arguing for 3 years how Russia was on the verge of collapse, and it had to sell its economy to China. Putin's been replaced by a body double. This whole stuff all along. They're fighting with shovels. Now it's Ukraine's attacks on Russia's oil facilities have been so effective that they have no more vehicles running, and they're forced to send donkeys and camels to the front. So yeah, I think sums up the logic right now. If they can just hold on a little longer, Russia will lose. So I'll let you get to your side before they overrun your position over there, Mark.
Yeah. So Gary and Babette, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on The Grass is Greener. And prepare out there. I am going to attempt to shake the foundations of the propaganda bubble that you obviously, or some of your audience at least, still finds themselves trapped in. All right, as you say, this and from afar, right? I've seen this and had a busy job over the last 3 years debunking all of this type of nonsense, right? You'll remember for the first 2.5 years it was, the Kiev regime is winning, and then it was, it's a stalemate, and now it's like, well, if we can just hang on, things will turn around, as they come up with these they are essentially hopium fantasies.
They've been saying they were hoping to turn the tide ever since they were winning. It was always this contradictory argument.
Yes.
We're winning, but don't worry, we'll turn the tide.
If you're not winning, then the tide doesn't need to turn. If you're winning, the tide doesn't need to turn, does it? So let's address a few of these things. I don't know where else this was published, but I first saw this article a few days ago. I do a daily feed that screens through Western mainstream media news on the Ukraine conflict and some other topics, just so I know what they're saying, and as I prepare to do battle with it. For the most part, occasionally, these nuggets of information will be revealed amidst the rest of the dross and the disinformation in the New York Times and the Washington Post, right? But I saw this in Business Insider, which evidently on MSNBC news feeds and the like has taken the role of the propaganda broadsheet, right? That just, they come out with dozens of small articles every day about the conflict in Ukraine, and they're all this type of salacious clickbait. And they tell people what they want to hear. That the U.S. side of this conflict, which is the Kiev regime in Ukraine, obviously, who the U.S. is backing. And I don't think that anyone would seriously argue that this isn't a proxy come hot war at this point, right? But you're right. They've touched, we've heard all kinds of ridiculous disinformation from the beginning, from the ghost of Kiev, this a Kiev regime fighter that shot down millions of Russian aircraft, evidently single-handedly, or this Snake Island martyrs hoax,
Oh yeah.
where these naval marine infantry on the Kiev regime held Snake Island, a little dot out in the ocean, in the Black Sea. Sorry, not the ocean, the Black Sea. And the supposedly a Russian warship commanded them to surrender, and they reportedly said, "F you, Russian warship," blah, blah. And this was memeable, and there were T-shirts and stamps and everything. I mean, it was just a whole phenomenon. And none of that was actually true, right? The Russian warship did and asked them to surrender, and they did. And then they were taken into custody as POWs. And then within like a couple months, they were transferred back to their families in Ukraine. That is what actually happened. But then yes, the Russians are fighting with shovels, somehow defeating the entirety of NATO's supplied and trained armies with shovels, evidently. And there's lots of jokes in Russia that the next next new powerful missile by Russia should be named the shovel in Russian, right? Just to mock this kind of news. But yeah, one of the most recent ones is this donkey story. Okay, so now
But they
even
have
this
cute hats on the donkeys.
yeah even this article at points at one point says it's not clear how widespread the use of donkeys is by the right, letting you know that the whole story is just they picked off of one post by one Russian military blogger and tried to blow it up into their clickbait goal, which is, the people want to hear, however untrue it is, that Russia is losing. So Russia is forced to use donkeys, right? Because they don't have any military vehicles left. At the same time, in the last week, you have had the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte come out and address the collective European members of NATO once again and lament that the Russian military-industrial complex is outcompeting all of the military complexes of all of the NATO countries collectively, including the United States, by more than 3 times. With regards at least to the type of military equipment and munitions that are useful for and needed in this conflict. Now you see the contradiction here, right? That is occurring. Is it that Russia is outproducing the West 3 times, or is that Russia is collapsing and is so desperate that they're using donkeys? Okay, so here is the reality. Now you may have noticed a change in the tempo of the conflict, particularly during January and probably January. Let's stick to the last week of December and January, and that's because there was a unexpected weather, if you want to say a climate change phenomenon. I would certainly be on board with that, but this part of the world, Russia and Ukraine, or not to say all of Russia, because it was quite different out in Siberia, but Western Russia and Ukraine, right, continental sized, they had, I believe it was the warmest winter or the warmest January. Because December was actually a pretty proper winter, but the warmest January, absolutely aberrant. The temperatures were above 0 for more than half of the month, right? Which means all of the snow and the ice that had melted. Now, for those of you who don't like the winter and the cold weather and whatever, you may say, well, that sounds great, right? Oh, they must have loved it, right? Well, okay, being as someone myself who actually loves winter and the snow, and my wife and I, we take all of our vacations, or most of them, in the Arctic, right? I mean,
Right.
we're that kind of crazy people. But anyway,
I have a friend who goes to Svalbard.
that's what Svalbard is wonderful. We've been there. We love Svalbard. That is Longyearbyen, and we did trips around the entirety of the islands and zodiac excursions and everything. It's wonderful. I would. Svalbard is the best vacation that we have ever had. But we're weird, right? So anyway. For those who don't know, Svalbard is an island far to the north of Norway in the Arctic Circle that is mostly ruled by Norway, although there is, by treaty, a Russian colony on the islands as well. It is properly in the Arctic Circle. It is It is a wonder. I myself, my wife and I, we saw the last time we were there 21 polar bears. 21.
I could tell you stories about Svalbard too, but we got to get to the war before the Ukrainians overrun your position.
Yes, forgive the digression there. You just touched something that I love out of the blue. So anyway, in this part of the world, right? Winter is viewed as good fighting weather, generally, right? Because the bad times of the year for fighting weather are late autumn and spring, right? Yeah. Because that is when everything turns to mud. And this is a big part of the world, right? It's big, a lot of big open territory, right? And in some places, the roads are fine, and in some places, not. I myself am from Pennsylvania that has had the worst roads on record in the United States pretty much for every year since modern record keeping began. So, I could completely understand this, but mud and roads and your ability to launch any type of large scale maneuver warfare where tanks and treaded vehicles go anywhere off road is impossible during these muddy seasons, right?
I'm gonna mispronounce, but like Rasputitsa or something.
Rasputitsa, like that. Yeah, you got it. Very close, right? It is a specific word for it, right? Therefore, once winter properly sets in, right, and everything freezes well below zero, that's good. That's good fighting weather for both sides, right? Particularly for Russia, but for the Kiev regime too, right? And everyone had plans for January based on that, but that didn't happen. We had this freak weather phenomenon where essentially during the entirety of January it was more like Rasputitsa, that has led to big problems with offensives that were planned on both sides and logistics. Now, it didn't mean that fighting stopped. It just means that plans had to change to take that into account. And in some areas of the conflict, right, there is combat taking place off of major road networks, right? And supplies are delivered a variety of means. One way, in small amounts, that has become very popular during this conflict is getting small amounts of equipment to troops that are, cut off logistically with drones, right? Drones can deliver, well, not a lot of things, but small amounts of bullets, water, cigarettes, things like that. That has become a regular thing during this conflict. But both sides have resorted to both high-tech solutions, right, when it was called for in this conflict, and both sides have resorted to occasional low-tech solutions on local levels when that proved to be the best solution, right? Maybe, the best of worst, right? Conditions, but that is what worked better than anything else at the time. And in this particular situation, in the forests of the Kursk region, right off of major road networks, it was easier through these dark, muddy forests to get supplies to troops on some small local levels with donkeys, right? Other things have been used on other occasions, and this is something that the Kiev regime has done as well. It's not a phenomenon, but this was something that was picked up by some Russian military blogger who had reported it and blown all out of proportion and context to meet propaganda reasons in the West. No, Russia is not running out of military vehicles of any way, shape, or form. If anyone is running out of military vehicles on a systemic level, it is the Kiev regime. As you will, if you look closely, you will see numerous reports in the Western media admitting growing use of the Kiev regime forced to use civilian vehicles in not everywhere, but at times and places to move their troops around. And not because the civilian vehicles were better for that particular situation, simply because that is all that they had available. So no, Russia is not running out of. No, as even the article hints, no, donkeys are not in widespread use across the Russian military or the Kiev regime military right now. It is just because of this freak weather in small, isolated circumstances with the particular environment. It made better sense. And I would have to say that considering that the prevalence of the use of FPV drones, how widespread their use has become in this conflict. And it must be said for artillery, which now receives its spotting from drones as well, that a one man, right, leading supplies to an isolated group stronghold on donkey is probably much less visible to drones than a particularly in forested areas than a vehicle, as well. So I mean, there are possible multiple reasons why this might make sense. Another such instance that was widely reported on, again trying to blow out of context, back in the late summer, I believe the early fall, Russia was making a lot of use of essentially modern infantry, or I should say dragoons. It's more like dragoons, right? It is a mounted charge across fields and trenches not in mass numbers, right? In small numbers, but by troops using motorcycles, because motorcycles could outpace the FPV drones that were being used to attack them, where something like infantry fighting vehicles couldn't. They were small and fast and maneuverable. And in certain places where it made environmental sense, Russia started using a lot of essentially motorized motorcycle dragoon charges. Then the troops would, throw the motorcycles to the side, dismount, and start clearing the trenches, and those worked pretty well for them, right? Another solution to that was what they called turtle tanks, where tanks were essentially surrounded by extra layers of sheet metal and stuff in order to protect them from FPV drone attacks, right? That's kind of the alternate. Rather than go fast and maneuverable, go slow and ridiculous looking excessive extra defenses that made them look like rolling sheds across the field. But in certain circumstances, they worked very well. An innovation that Russia is using right now, again, because of the prevalence of drones on the battlefield and how drone casualties have taken a lead, is there are reports that right now, as Russia is continuing to storm the Ukrainian-held position in Chasiv Yar, in central Donbass, which was the fallback position from Bakhmut. Again, a problem getting logistics through, particularly over the last month, considering these abnormal warm weather conditions. under the threat of FPV drones. So Russia has built a logistics corridor, presumably along one of the operable roads. They are literally surrounding the road for large, almost the entirety of kilometers of stretches on three sides with tight, thick mesh walls and ceiling, effectively creating a barrier against FPV drones striking their logistics chain. That is, I mean, you're creating a mesh corridor to protect your logistics corridor from drones. This is the type of crazy, future warfare that is taking place right now in Ukraine, and all types of weird, innovative, low tech, high tech, just weird tech and no tech solutions are being hit on, often by, innovative commanders and troops on local levels that, that have, contrary again to what is reported in a lot of the Western media, the ability to make decisions to try things like this.
I mean, every time they do something that's creative and adaptable and shows that they're flexible and able to respond to circumstances, it gets propagandized as being somehow desperate, right? They have to do this. It's like, well, no, they're clever, they're smart. They found a way around the problem.
See the contradiction between the other propaganda sort is that the Russian military are all complete robots, and that the local non-commissioned officers and low-level officers have no authority to make decisions on their own, and it's all directed from the generals, and they all just respond like robots and run off cliffs like lemmings and conduct meat assaults. So it's either one or the other, right? If you can't propagandize them one way, then you do it the other way. If they're not all innovativeless robots, then they are desperate, right? I mean, you got to hit it one way or the other.
It's Schrodinger everywhere.
Yeah.
One thing I've noticed is in the Western press, you hear about, this is going to be, whatever it is, this is going to be the new wonder weapon, and it's going to, we're giving it to Ukraine, and it's going to change the war. And it'll last for like maybe a week or two, and then there'll be some change. I mean, or you won't hear about it anymore. I'm assuming that's because Russia has adapted.
Yeah, either Russia has adapted or it wasn't that wondrous in the first place, right? There was an article out, I can't remember who wrote it now. I've been talking about Russia's dominance in electronic warfare since the beginning of this conflict. But there was an article in the Western media, I guess almost a year ago now, talking about high-tech U.S. weapons, right? That they work, as the headline said, until they don't. And they talk about how quickly Russian electronic warfare and Russian air defense, which are both the best in the world, right? The U.S. does other things well, like aircraft carriers, power projections, stealth fighters, right? Those, are what the U.S. focused on because they were an aggressive power. Russia, the Soviet Union, and then into Russia was a defensive power. So they focused countering NATO's offensive advantages, focusing on air defense and electronic warfare to defend, to counter against NATO's strengths. And so Russia has very superiority. And in this article, and many other articles that have been more honest since then, piecemeal, they've admitted that Russian electronic warfare and air defense very quickly learns from Western weapons and nullifies them, right? And one of the things that Russia's electronic air defense or electronic warfare does very well is they block GPS signals, right? And all these fancy satellite guided munitions, whether we're talking HIMARS rounds or ground launched small diameter bombs or other types of weapons they've provided the Kiev regime, they all rely on this satellite guidance. And Russian electronic warfare can very quickly learn, with a new weapon, how to cancel out that signal. And they do. And then it just becomes a useless hunk of metal floating through space, unable to find its target, right? Or in the case of some drones, Russian electronic warfare can actually capture the drones, right? Take control of them and just
Yeah,
add them to
yeah.
their own
Yeah,
stocks.
the New York Times article talked about how in Kherson the
Yeah.
Ukrainians would
Mhm.
set up the drones and they'd just
Yeah.
like drift
Yeah.
away because the Russians took them over.
Yeah. And this is not something that has been acknowledged, but the West has, in the last, I would say, not quite a year, but last 8 months or so, been providing a lot of new, presumably experimental electronic warfare of their own to the Kiev regime. And that is it's not something that they put on this is the weapons we're sending public announcements or something. A lot of weapons are being sent and they're not being publicly announced. And so there is an electronic warfare war going on inside this conflict very much now. And it is very much its own arms race of signal identification and jamming back and forth. It's going on. Russia still clearly has both the quantitative and qualitative advantage, but that's not to say that, that the Kiev regime with Western weapons doesn't occasionally, locally or whatever, get a leg up for a time being. It's a tough conflict, right? It is a real near peer conflict, and it is hard and bloody, and both sides are innovating up and down, high tech, low tech, any way they can come up with to keep their own forces alive and to kill the opponents. It is, not something, even people like me who have served in militaries, it can't prepare you for this type of conflict, because this type of conflict hasn't been held, since World War II, and technology has changed. Things
Yeah,
have changed.
I mean, this kind of conflict has never been done. I mean, everything is
Yes.
all new.
It does seem like some of it is being used as a weapons laboratory.
Oh, absolutely, on both sides, right? Certainly the West, yes, but absolutely Russia as well. Russia is unveiling new weapons. What's more is that the cycle, the evolution of weapons on the Russian side, and to a lesser extent on the Kiev regime side, if only because they don't have anywhere near the military industrial capacity that Russia does, because Russia has wiped out their own military industrial complex, right? At this point, they do everything in hidden, literal, underground, small workshops, or they get provided with Western weapons, right? So Russia has mass military industrial complex industry of scale, which means they can pick up any innovation and use it on a much larger level. But both sides they are evolving their weapons, not only new weapons, but the weapons are improving and adapting on an almost bi-monthly basis, right? It's happening so fast. And
Hyper
this is
accelerated.
hyper accelerated. And this is actually something that people who really understand what's going on in this conflict within the Western defense establishments are warning about, that warfare technology, technology-driven warfare is changing so fast in this conflict that actually Western military-industrial complexes are at serious risk of being so far left behind of the lessons learned from this conflict, because the lessons just keep coming and evolving faster and faster and faster during this. And this is something that's denied at a narrative level, but has been admitted by a few people, like the U.S. General Cavioli has spoken to the Senate. He is the supreme commander of NATO forces in Europe, and he has testified. Whatever the
Cavoli,
propaganda, Cavoli, whatever the Western narrative, may say about, oh, we're weakening Russia, all of this nonsense. And he's pointed out the reality. The Russian military is much, much larger than it was before this conflict. The Russian military-industrial complex is producing vehicles, munitions, armaments at a much, much faster and better level than they were before this conflict. And Russian troops have combat experience now that no other military in the world has in a type of conflict like this. In the last few decades, the U.S. military had all of this experience from all these small wars that they fought in Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya and Serbia, and wherever, the hegemony was sticking their nose in. And that gave the U.S. military an experience advantage over every other military on the planet. Now, with the scale of this war, the exposure to all kinds of Western weapons and technologies that have been handed to the Kiev regime or used by Western special forces on the ground, with Ukrainian flags on. It has allowed the Russian military to gain combat experience, both at a force level, but at a structural level that the West just simply doesn't have now. And the smart people are saying, well, we really don't want this conflict to drag on where, it becomes a NATO-Russia conflict at the end, because we can't win that conflict now.
I mean, we've been hearing for 40 years how the U.S. keeps investing the lion's share of its military spending on obsolete systems. And
Yeah.
now you've got something going on that makes obsolescence much quicker and renders
Yes.
much more stuff obsolete. And you're looking at all of this like sunk costs into a U.S. military that is just rapidly becoming like, yesterday's, we have Polish cavalry.
Yeah, the U.S. military-industrial complex over the last few decades of the unipolar moment has become bloated and self-satisfied and inefficient, right? The U.S. was fighting small counterinsurgency wars across the Islamic world, or they were building these high-tech technological boondoggles like the littoral combat ship and the F-35. And
35 is big, Hugh.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So good luck with that.
We make them in state, so it's good for jobs.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Well, that's the pork side of it, right? That's the bloated side of it. But what it has resulted in is that the for-profit U.S. military-industrial complex is not built to scale for a peer conflict, a war of attrition that requires things like artillery shells or the ability to quickly evolve, right? And meet needs by necessity that are occurring on the battlefield. It's too bloated. Things are too expensive. And that's growing to be recognized, but it's not an easy solution. Which is why, despite 3 years into this conflict, that the U.S. military-industrial complex still can't be ramped up to anywhere approach the Russian, because it's on this for-profit basis that requires large amount of government investment that is not forthcoming. And the Russian side, they kept all of their surplus capacity at the end of the Cold War, right? In their still largely, it's kind of like partial privatization. They were allowed to sell things to other countries and the like for profit, but the domestic military has always had to be prioritized over everything else. But not only that, with the state financing, that surge capacity that was not being used was kept updated. right? It was kept modernized all through this. So when it was needed, Russia was ready to fight this war that it has essentially been preparing for since World War II,
Yeah.
right? A war across the Europe Eurasian steppes, against whatever opponent, right?
Right,
That's where
right. I
the
mean, the
enemy has
Nazis
always come
invaded
from.
them through Ukraine,
Yes.
and they were ready for that
But
to happen again.
before that, Napoleon, before that,
Yeah.
the Sweden, right? The Swedish Empire at one point. It's happened again and again. The Poles and Russia was ready for it, and the West wasn't ready, partly because they no longer viewed Russia. They took, as any type of threat or even a peer competitor at every level, right? Russia had been defeated, with the self dissolution, or as the U.S. won the Cold War, and they should have stayed dead and defeated, right? And how did that ever happen? That suddenly they've emerged as an unquestioned great power, along with the U.S. and China. The U.S. as it falls from hyperpower status
Yeah.
to only, in terms of great power, maybe still first among equals, but increasingly just barely so.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that keeps coming up is you mentioned shells, right? If you're going to build something for the U.S. military, there's a lot of money in having something high tech that you can have a glossy brochure for. You can inflate the cost. You can sell it up and down Capitol Hill. But if you're going to like make something like a shell or a bullet, it's like there's nothing to sell there. It's not sexy, right?
No, it's not sexy. It's not profitable, right? You can't increase costs at every level on something like that. So investment hasn't gone into that, and it has to be said. Like, take a look at a couple of these supposed Western wonder weapons, like the Abrams tank or the British Challenger tank that were provided to the Kiev regime. Both, there is some quiet admission that both performed terribly. They were too heavy, right? They were tanks of another era. They were tanks of the 80s that haven't effectively evolved, even with modest modernization steps. They were too heavy for the environment. So you see a lot of these
Did they
high-tech
sink in the
weapons
mud?
yeah, they sank in the mud
I was going to
all
say,
the time, right?
particularly for the
And
season,
they
right?
they
Yeah.
were slow, and they became targets of FPV drones so easily because of that, right? And increasingly, by artillery as well. And so another phenomenon of these high tech, U.S. wonder weapons is they perform great in the laboratories, right? Or on carefully staged demonstrations in the field, but in the actual battlefield under environmental conditions in different areas, it turns out that they're too high tech and they don't work well with mud or sand or whatever it is, mice chewing
Right.
wires. I've heard complaints, the
Yeah.
actual battlefield conditions, and they're too high tech to be able to quickly do repairs and
Yeah.
maintenance on
Yeah.
in the field,
Russian
right?
tanks, you can do that. With U.S. tanks, you can't even fix them in
Yes,
Ukraine. You have to take them back
yes.
to Poland and fix
Well,
them.
they have
Or
to. Yes, exactly, right. Even Germany, things have been had to pull back to repair and refurbish them. While Russian vehicles are all built using a lot of similar parts across different vehicle models and everything, specifically so that parts can easily be exchanged, and to keep the logistics chain small to fight a a war of this is something that the West has always sneered at, right? Or Western
yeah.
defense, military people, the idea of quantity, right? Oh, quality will always surpass quantity. Well, they've first of all, it's turned out that quantity, yes, does indeed have a value all its own. Secondly, right, in the time and place, it turns out that Russian weapons often had the quality advantage as well, right? At least on a par, and in many, performance indicators, better for the type of war that Russia expected to fight, which was a war in its near abroad against the West, which it's now handily winning.
So we heard just last week from a fellow talking about exactly what was going on in terms of all the different crises afflicting Ukraine right now. How are things in Russia?
Yeah. Um, actually, again, this is going to be completely break a propaganda bubble that in various places has been actually admitted to in the Western media, but it's always left out of the narrative. The Russian economy is not collapsing. The Russian economy is not about to collapse. The Russian economy is not going to collapse anytime in the near future. You can just take that hopium and smoke it. Right. I mean, it's that's all it is at this point. Right. Russia has endured more than 24,000 sanctions. Right. In the last 3 years. And the Russian economy, even by international accounting, right? If you don't trust the Russian government numbers, then, you really got no choice left if you want to, accept the IMF, the World Bank, the various UN institutions or a UN adjacent institutions. The Russian economy is growing. The Russian economy's growth rate is actually at a higher level and has been for the last 3 years than the U.S.'s own.
I mean, you've seen all the data from all the adjacent countries too, where their imports and exports have just skyrocketed because everything is coming in and going to Russia and coming back from Russia and going out.
Yeah. So here's some of the reality. So if you'll notice some of what has been reported in the West in the last 3 years, while enduring this existential economic war of sanctions that was meant to rubble the ruble and destroy the Russian economy and Russia, right? Russia has, in terms of GDP per purchasing power parity, which is, for those in the know, GDP is kind of a useless number statistically. It's just for bragging. But GDP adjusted for purchasing power parity is the only real way to compare countries around the world who don't use the dollar as their currency, right? And for GDP purchasing power parity, Russia has jumped both Germany and Japan in the last 3 years to unquestionably become the fourth largest economy in the world after China, the United States, and India. Both Germany and Japan. One, because of the consequence, the blowback of the sanctions that Germany put on Germany, on Russia. They've deindustrialized their own economies by making energy too expensive for their own industry and collapse their own economy as a result.
And now they're going to be subject to U.S. tariffs.
Tariffs as well, right? They get it coming and going.
The end of Nord Stream did not help.
Yes. Yeah, that was, part. Right? That was to give them no step back, even if they weren't accepting Russian pipeline gas. So yeah, it's Viktor Orban described, I think, the effect of Europe's sanctions on Russia, the blowback from them, not so much as Europe shooting itself in the foot with the sanctions, but Europe shooting itself in the lungs with these sanctions, which is more apt. But Russia, so it has jumped 2 in terms of GDP purchasing power parity. Also, again, according to international statistics, Russia has, for the first time, been recognized as a high-income country, which means that the majority of its citizens, for the first time, are considered, on a par with Western, right, citizens, right? They enjoy a high standard of life, have large amounts of disposable income, have a considerable amount of property that they own, whether we're talking housing, which is actually much higher in Russia than it is, on a percentage term in the U.S. And keep in mind with all these numbers that Russia's population is less than half that of the United States, and of course much, much smaller than China and India. So for Russia to be in that rank in the 4th position in the world is actually an indication of how strong the Russian economy is. Russians' average salaries have increased dramatically, or I shouldn't say dramatically. They have increased significantly on average in the last 3 years. Russians have lots of disposable income. Russia has not resorted to a war economy, as some parts of the Western narrative have tried to suggest. It is not that Russia has the actual effects of the conflict, the sanctions, have had very little effect on the average Russian, right? Imagine how much effect the Iraq war had on Americans economically. That has been the extent of the effect of this conflict on the average Russian consumer, right, or citizen, right? However, which way you want to term it.
Yeah, U.S. sanctions on Chad really deprived us of a lot of sorghum here.
Sorry, yeah. Russian. Now, the one thing that Western media has tried to pick up as part of their Russia is the new Russia is about to economically collapse, is that inflation in Russia has kicked up a bit in the last, I would say, a little bit less than a year. But it's pushing over, it has at times been pushing over 10%, which is higher certainly than the Russian central bank wanted. And they've done things like raising interest rates in an attempt to lower it. But it's not some type of ridiculous inflation that you see in countries like, say, Argentina or somewhere where whose economies are actually and if you actually take a look at
Venezuela.
It's comparable to inflation in Europe, or Americans have become well familiar with inflation of their own in the last couple of years, and dealing with the effects of that as well. Everyone would like it, but when average Russian salaries are increasing and the economy is growing, that's actually something that adds to the inflation, right? It becomes that the success actually causes a bit of inflation. So at this point, the Russian central bank keeps trying to actually slow the Russian economy down. And they actually haven't had a lot of success with that, because one of the problems is that the West Western companies pulled out of the Russian market, which left part of that was filled by import substitution from other countries that Russia does trade with, but a lot of it has been taken up. The majority of it has been taken up by Russian companies, right? And all of these Russian wealthy people that previously liked to invest money in the West, well, they were persecuted like every Russian was, right? In this stupid Russophobic view that the West took, right? Not just against the government, but against every Russian must be punished, right? Attitude. So the wealthy Russians, they've invested their money in Russia over the last 3 years in a way that they weren't doing, when they could, invest it in other places in the last few decades. And all of that money has just, again, it's led to growth and growth and growth. Russian agriculture, Russian manufacturing, even automobile manufacturing, all these things are actually booming.
Yeah, they used to invest in the European company that owned that factory in Russia,
sure.
And now they're investing in the Russian company that owns that factory in Russia.
Or a lot of these Western, these Russian wealthy people, they wanted to invest in vineyards in Tuscany or things like that, right? This, European elite type stuff, and now they're investing in filling domestic manufacturing, consumer demand in Russia. And they're making large amounts of money off of it, right? And it's leading to further internal growth of the Russians. And on top of that, you have, of course, with all of these commodities that Russia provides to the world, right? In the largest commodity provider to the global market, whether we're talking oil or gas or grain, which Russia is by far the largest supplier to the world. Right, the world needs fertilizer. This is already fertilizer. All of these things, metals, they're all factored into the global market already. Any attempts to cut them out of the market by the West, and it has only ever been the West putting sanctions on them, they just get bought elsewhere in the global market, and then like the Europeans have been buying Russian oil all this time. It's simply now that India and Turkey buy all the Russian oil and then mix it with 10% of oil from other countries and then sell it back to the Europeans at a significant markup,
Yeah.
right? And the Europeans pay much more and get much less and pay much more for it. When you have finite commodities that everyone in the world needs, people are going to find a way to buy them, right? And someone is always going to. So the end result of this has been that Russia, when the prices of these commodities go up as a disruption of economic supply chains, the Russian government makes out because they're making more money on a barrel of oil than before, right? And they're still finding plenty of people around the world to buy it because the rest of the world did not join the West in this war of sanctions on Russia. So,
Yeah. And we're not doing very well at shaming those countries into like,
Yeah.
follow us, follow us. It's like,
Yeah.
it doesn't make any sense for them economically to do that.
Which is not to say that everything is perfect in the Russian economy, right? 10% inflation, it's too high, right? You want to bring those things down. But by and large, not only is Russia not in danger of economic collapse, it is booming. And there is a growing understanding within Russia that Russia doesn't need the West, even after this conflict ends. Do we really want to get back in bed with them? Do we really want to ever reconnect to SWIFT? Do we ever, want to do all these things we were cut off and make ourselves vulnerable to that again? No, the rest of we're doing just fine. The West is not the world anymore, right? The rest of the world, the West, you could argue the West has never been the world, but certainly in economics terms, the unipolar moment is over, and the rise of Asia and other parts of the world economically have meant that Russia has plenty of economic partners out there, and even technological partners, right? With Russia and China and India working together on both weapons and consumer systems and domestic airplanes and all of these sorts of things. That there was for a long time a belief that the West innovates. That the U.S. is the best innovators on the planet and that no one can innovate like we can. Well, I think increasingly things like DeepSeek have just crushed, increasingly crushed. Yeah, the ego of the United States in that regard. But that's just the tip of an iceberg that has long been looming.
Yeah, and it's going to be not going to be just China. It's eventually going to be most of the world that's in that state. Everyone is sort of rising at the same time.
Yeah.
Let me we've got a couple minutes left. Let's give something about the Ukrainian attacks on oil refineries and depots in the border areas. It's like is that significantly hurting Russia? I imagine
no. It's something that happens, right? And Russia's air defense and electronic warfare block most of it. But yeah, some of it always gets through. Some of it will always get through, and they cause some damage. But it's something that is always blown out of extreme proportion. And what is unreported is that Russia is doing the same to the Kiev regime in Ukraine on a nightly level, on a much larger scale. But reporting those things, even taking pictures of them, posting them on social media, is a criminal offense under the Kiev regime, right? If you're a man, you get sent to the front. If you're a woman, you get sent to prison, right? That's why you hear, and also because of the biases and prejudices of the Western media. At the end of the day, it hasn't had any effect on the Russian economy. It hasn't had any effect on the supplies, oil or otherwise, of vehicles at the front. No, they're not using donkeys because they don't have oil for vehicles anymore. And what's more, domestic prices for gasoline, diesel in Russia have not significantly gone up beyond the inflation rate either. So it's pinpricks, really. I mean, I don't want to say that it doesn't have any effect, but it's certainly not having any type of systemic effect that is going to change what has long been an inevitable course of this conflict. They can still cause some damage, but they can't stop the Russian military with this level of attacks. No, they can't.
I did want to ask where things are going with potential talks, because the U.S. has been saying, oh, well, we can offer you all these things, such as with SWIFT and all that, but that doesn't seem to be a real good, thing to offer. Are there talks? Do you see them coming soon?
Okay, so breaking news that was just out in the last hour is that Putin and Trump, both sides, have now admitted have now had an hour and a half phone call. And
we're recording this February 12th, by the way, just so people know what today is.
This is breaking news, which makes me believe they haven't talked directly before this. And we've had the prisoner exchange, and it wasn't just America getting a person back, by the way. Russia is also getting people back. But anyway, these are small positive steps. But Russia and the U.S. have a lot to talk about globally. It's not just about Ukraine. And at the end of the day, I'm still afraid that because of Russia's success and where they are on the battlefield, that there's just no U.S. president, not even Donald Trump, no matter how much contempt or disregard he has for Zelensky or Ukraine, can accept the terms that the Russia will demand. And that it will be like, hey, we're glad we're talking again, but sorry, your plan doesn't work for us. You're on the losing side of this conflict. You don't dictate two terms to us. We dictate terms to you. We'll just continue if you don't give us, our terms diplomatically. We'll take it militarily. And at that point, Trump will have to make the decision. Does he escalate to de-escalate, or does he walk away? Unfortunately, I still don't see that the two countries' interests can be met in this conflict. Someone is going to have to lose, and at the point, I don't think the U.S. is going to win diplomatically because of Trump's deal where they lost on the battlefield. It's still, I don't see a diplomatic settlement that both sides can accept.
I know you have another interview to go to and a strict deadline, and we're already at the hour. Can you please just tell people where to find you, and then we can let you go?
Sure. Again, Babette, Gary, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to be on the show. You can follow me on Twitter X at Mark Sloboda1, the number 1, or you can follow me at The Real Politique with Mark Sloboda on Substack and Telegram.
All right.
It's been great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much for being on the show, Mark Sloboda.
Cheers. Look forward to next time.
Right. Thank you. We too. Us too.
Cheers.
Bye-bye. Okay, well, before we go out, we have a couple of quick announcements.
We have We Rise Fighting Labor podcast presents Building Worker Power Corporate Research class on February 20th. Presenting is organizer, podcaster, and artist Rick Urrutia from 6 to 8 p.m. at the Labor Temple in Madison, 1602 South Park. And the other thing is, in honor of Black History Month, Wisconsin Bail Out the People presents a People's Forum, Black Freedom Struggle and Palestine, Saturday, February 22nd, at 2222 South Park Street in Madison. You can also find out, that's from 2 to 4, and you can find out more information at wibopm.org.
Okay, well, thank you. And thank you again to Mark Sloboda. That's it. Thanks. Bye-bye.